Hello, and welcome to another episode of Never Go Against the Family. We're coming to you live from the University of Northern Iowa Family Business Center in Cedar Falls, Iowa. We follow family businesses and topics that help your family business sustain itself.
So our roots go back to my great-grandfather, Giuseppe Basile, who immigrated, here in the early 1900s. He came over from, San Pier Niceto in Sicily. And he's, the one that really started, the business on his side. And my grandfather followed in his footsteps. My grandfather was the one that was part of a three-way merger in the 40s that brought three families together to some degree. So my grandfather being that second, generation, that three-way merger didn't last very long. It lasted about 2 years.
Okay.
And that's kind of where the company name, came from, because it was Catania Imported, which is a town in Sicily, Spanier Olive Oil, which was his brother-in-law, and they formed Catania Spanier Corporation. And that's who we are today. We have a DBA for Catania Oils.
Oh, okay. Would you say that Joseph, that would be your grandfather, and I'm assuming your namesake, maybe, or not?
Correct. That the Italian tradition was the firstborn was named after the grandfather. So Giuseppe became Joseph essentially. And that kind of followed down the family tree until my wife ruined it.
Is she Italian?
No, she's Irish.
No. Well, very
So, yeah. So my son should have been Anthony after my father,
Yep.
but we named him Tyler. So
Okay.
his middle name is Joseph.
All right. I kind of drew a little family tree for myself just to kind of keep that straight. So you were talking a little bit about how back in the 40s, your grandfather came back from World War II, merged with his cousins, I think, right?
Brother-in-law, cousins.
Oh, several. Okay.
Yeah, there was three of them, three partners that came together.
And then eventually they parted ways. And I'm wondering if there's anything that ever got passed down to you through that parting of ways of, like, I don't know if I'd say lessons learned, but maybe things that, or it's once bitten, twice shy, maybe a little bit, or is it?
Well, I think for sure, and certainly my father can relate, a lot more than I can, but a lot of those lessons have certainly been, instilled, into me over the years. I've been involved in the business, since I was, 12 years old. So I've, heard all sorts of, stories and lessons and whatnot. And one of the things my father, would always say is, the company is here for the masses, not for the individual.
Okay.
And that is, an important lesson to understand, that you got to be doing what's best for the company, not best for just, one individual. And, that certainly has, been something that has created divide at times, where you have individuals that are in the business in some shape or form, that are really only out for their own, well-being.
Yeah.
And that can be very, detrimental to the ownership, as well as, the actual operation of the company too. I think it really depends on, what type of organization do you have? Do you have one where you just own and you have others that are running the company? Or is it kind of, owner and you also operate it yourself? Because obviously there's a distinct difference between the two. So when you own something and you are, the one running it,
Yeah.
or multiple, owners that are running it, you have to have the right, approach.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that changes the dynamics for the family each time.
Yeah, and my grandfather, my grandfather passed away 2001. No, sorry, 2003. I was 24, 25, maybe I want to say. I just got married at that point in time. So I had an opportunity to, spend a lot of time with him, during my childhood, during my teenage years when
Mhm.
I was, working in the plant. So I would always, hear directly from him some of the first, hand, stories and whatnot. So,
Wow.
he was kind of, grooming me to some degree, teaching me without me even understanding it when I was very young.
I
My brother and I used to go to work with him on the weekends. We were, I don't know, 10 minutes from the plant. And he was one of those ones that, hey, he retired, but he can never just shut it off. So although he didn't have, call it the day-to-day responsibility of running the company, he
Mhm.
still just had to be around it. So, he would go into that office every single day, 7 days a week, regardless, what was going on. So he used to pick us up on weekends, and the plant was closed typically on the weekend, but he
Sure.
would just bring us there and hey, go sweep the floor, go
Yeah,
do
yeah,
this.
yeah.
We have leakers, oil does leak, and you got stained cases, so he would show us how to repackage or take care of it or whatever else, and just spending that quality time with him was something special. So you learn a lot of things just being around him.
Oh yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Joseph, because it's like I think a lot of times what happens is that, the if you think of the generations of the family and I don't know if Anthony, if your dad or your uncles and or aunts too, when they can pass down knowledge to a generation below them, to
Yep.
the grandkids, like you were able to absorb from your grandfather. I think that's just it gives you a whole more robust experience and more tacit knowledge of what happened in the past or how we gotten to
Right.
where we are now. More.
No, it's 100%, correct. And, I'm one of, I think the quantity, say 14 grandkids or something for that, degree, the oldest. So that age spread between, me being the oldest and the youngest, I'm not even sure what that is, 12 years, 14 years, whatever it is. But my point is, my younger cousins didn't necessarily get to have that same luxury where they were old enough to understand or have that type of relationship with my grandfather because they were just too young.
Sure.
Um, so I had a lot more exposure and interaction, and not only heard, stories and lessons and mentorship from my father, but I also had it with my grandfather.
Yeah.
So that was just, cool, dynamic because you're hearing, similar stories or lessons or perspective. And, my grandfather was the one that really went through the thick and thin regarding, the company, and he could have given up many different, points in time where, he didn't have, two pennies to rub together,
Sure.
and, he had it really tough. He's the one that really established the business and allowed for that, generational transfer to some degree. And, similar to other generations, provided that next generation, that next foundation in a sense.
Yeah.
And my dad's generation was able to build, upon, what their dad did for them. And then obviously we had that same, opportunity, but obviously at a much different, level.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and then the challenge becomes how do we leave it better than we found it type of thing,
Correct.
right?
How do you sustain it for that next,
Yeah.
generation? How do you be a good shepherd of the resource of the asset and be able to provide, appropriate, structure to pass that on?
Yeah, I like you sharing that term, good shepherd. I think that's a good, it just encapsulates kind of what separates some families from others is when you think of yourself as a steward of the business or a shepherd of things rather than, this is mine and when I'm done, whatever happens, happens type of
Right.
thing. One other thing I wanted to touch on quick with you here on our podcast today was on employment policies. So I know that you've mentioned a couple times that you have a next generation coming in, which will be the fifth generation of ownership, which is pretty, I mean, obviously amazing. You're an asterisk to begin with, right? In terms of one in a million or whatever it is. And so what kinds of things are you putting together or thinking through at the fourth generation level to kind of impact how you bring in your kids and your nieces, nephews, etc.
I mean, obviously that topic is, critical to that succession, of the business. And for my generation, obviously it was much different. We had a different, exposure to the company. When I was a teenager in the 90s, the business environment was nowhere it is, today. Even, just from like a, child walk perspective, I guess is one
Yeah.
way of looking at it. Like, being a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old, kid, being in a warehouse or somewhat of a whatever that production environment looked like, back then, you never could do that today.
Yeah, I wouldn't say.
Um, but the one nice thing, for me growing up was I got a significant appreciation for how the business operates at that floor level. Understanding, what that hard work looked like, how that business really ticked. Technology really wasn't a thing back then. There was a lot of, manual processes, manual labor, computers were starting to come into the business environment. And it wasn't until I kind of exited college where that was starting to occur. Websites were starting to come into play, email, and so on and so forth. So as a kid, I got, throughout, being from 12 all the way through college, my summers were in the plants working, all the different, jobs to really gain that, appreciation, you call it.
Mhm.
So for me, entering the business and, my generation was really about scaling it and bringing in more external, call it expertise, being a closely held family, business. We wore multiple different hats. Everything was just really closely held.
Yep.
Even going and the facility that we had before, like no non-family members had alarm codes or keys to the facility. So
Sure.
when we relocated back in the early 90s, that was one of those first things that started to change where you're starting to open up a little bit more and bringing others, call it, into the fold. And some of my, early involvement with the company, those were some of the things that we did where we started to actually build out, a management team. We had 100 employees at that particular point in
Okay.
time. Actually, no, probably like 40, 50 employees.
Okay.
And, we were on the cusp of doing, call it $100 million in sales, and we didn't even have a controller,
Okay.
didn't have an HR department.
Sure.
And those are some of the things that I started to slowly bring, to the table about those different, concepts and changes and so on and so forth. And, from 2000 and I don't know, 5 to maybe 2012, we started to do a lot of those things there where we brought in a controller, brought in somebody from HR, brought on, started to form more of like a leadership, team,
Yeah.
which was going to position us, for those next levels of growth. So for me, and I know this is a long-winded answer to the question,
No.
but I lacked that outside experience. I came right out of college, I did some co-ops, and I came right into the company. I
Okay.
didn't have management experience anywhere else or any other business experience other than the four walls as I knew it. I got introduced to other outside resources like a CEO advisory group, Vistage.
Yeah. All the
Um,
general. Well, yep.
so I've been in Vistage now for probably 7 or 8 years,
Okay.
as well as some other things that really helped give me different exposure, give me different support systems. So, through that process, and again, it wasn't until the last, I'd say 4 or 5 years that next generation wasn't even a thought at that particular point in time. The kids were still too young.
Yeah. Sure.
But as I started to frame an opinion and a perspective based on my own personal experiences, to me, it's like, look, the company is stable. Back when I first came into the company, my dad really wanted to get us involved because he had everything so closely held. There was no outsiders.
Yep.
And as things became bigger and bigger, it was just too much for him to do. So when I entered the business, it was kind of like, okay, take this, take this, take that. And as those
Because you
things
were the guy you could
occurred,
trust too, right?
correct.
Yeah.
So as that started to occur, and you gained, the trust, you were doing things the way he wanted them, and so on and so forth.
Hmm.
Naturally things just continued to flow. But again, looking back and reflect, I didn't know what I was doing with some of those things regarding like leadership. You
Sure.
know,
Yeah.
so for me, as my son today is 20. He's a sophomore in college.
Hmm.
He was the oldest of that next, call it, generation. So probably when he was 15 or so, being in high school, I knew that, hey, it wasn't appropriate at that age. He could not follow in the footsteps that I had at that type of age being in the business.
Yep.
And for my father, my grandfather, it was always very important that you got your hands dirty. You enter that business at that ground level and gain the appreciation and respect for what it takes. But I couldn't introduce that being 15 years old in today's environment into a
Sure.
manufacturing, plant that we
Yeah,
have today.
shut down. Yeah.
Correct. So it was like, all right, well, baby steps. So when he turns 18, there'll be an opportunity for him to follow what I did, although it will be delayed. And he's going to have a much limited, call it, exposure to what I had. I had, I don't know, almost 10 years of it, off and on.
Yep.
He was going to only get like a small, call it, taste of it. So, as I thought about it, to me, it was more about what the one regret that I have is I never had that external experience outside of the company, understanding how other companies operated, understanding how their leaders like led the company and the things that they did, and being able to take those outside experiences here and help us grow and develop and so on and so forth. So we've had to rely on others from that leadership team that come in and bring those unique experiences. So for me, it formed the opinion being like, look, for that next generation, there's no rush and there's going to be no pressure to join, the company.
Okay.
My son is, a business marketing slash business analytics double major.
Mhm.
So he may find a job somewhere and he might find a career path that is appropriate for him and never have an interest into the business. That's okay. That is perfectly fine.
Yeah.
So I formed the opinion of, look, go to college. You need to get a good degree. Who knows what the future brings, for the company, but you got to go get a job somewhere else, and you got to get some experience. And 3 to 5 years down the road, opportunity presents itself here, and you want to come consider entering the business. We'll talk and we'll figure things out. But again, no pressure. But you got to get that outside experience.
So have you had those kinds of conversations now that your son is old enough to kind of talk
Yes.
through that a little bit?
Yep, I got 3 kids. I got a
Oh,
sophomore in college, a freshman daughter in college, and then a sophomore in high school. My 3 are the oldest of the fifth, generation. There's at least 14 grandkids in my dad's, side of the family. So there's probably, I don't know, 20 plus, grandkids, call it, in that
Sure.
fifth, generation. I do not expect all, 20 to come in. Who knows, what happens, but I've made it perfectly, clear, specifically, with me running the company. This is my terms, this is my structure. Individuals, want an opportunity to come work for the company, no problem. You got to have the experience, you got to be qualified, but you got to get outside experience.
Yeah.
I mean, to some degree, you can say, what happens if we sold the company? You're not going to have any other experience to fall back on.
Yeah, that's true too. Yeah.
So it's hard to know what, transpires, although it's not a consideration at this particular, point in time, but you never know what happens. So, for their own benefit, go get experience elsewhere. Jobs aren't necessarily handed out here because of who you are or what your name is.
Sure.
But it's important to really go understand what it's like to work for somebody else.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. We're always trying to champion that concept to the families in our program, and having it heard and told firsthand, I think, by somebody who's implementing it with their own kids, which is, maybe the toughest, right? When it's maybe your siblings' kids or something, it's not quite as
Sure.
tough,
Oh yeah. I mean, I've had my daughter say like, why do I have to do that? I'm like, because it's important.
Yeah.
I'm like, you're gonna appreciate and understand it in the future, hopefully. But what 16-year-old, or 17 or 18-year-old really knows what they want to be doing? Like,
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. Wow, this is great. I'm glad that you were able to touch on that topic specifically, because it's such an important one for families as they get from, second, third generation where it's maybe a little bit all hands on deck to, as they've scaled enough and built up enough that they can kind of afford to let the kids go do things a little bit, and they should go do things. So I appreciate you sharing that with us, Joseph. I greatly appreciate your time being on with us today and Never Go Against the Family, our podcast here at UNI.
Anytime. Happy to get help.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Never Go Against the Family, a podcast produced by the University of Northern Iowa Family Business Center. You can find more information about the center, membership, and upcoming events at unifamilybusinesscenter.com. As Vito Corleone advises, never go against the family.